My name is Evelyn Rosa Hart. I'm 29 years old. I live in Portland, Maine. A one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, the kind of place that smells faintly of detergent and sea salt. I work nights as an ER technician, which is a polite way to say I see people at their worst and try not to let it scar me the way my childhood did. Right now, my life is a strange mix of stability and tremor. I pay my bills on time, I can make a pot of coffee that doesn't taste like cardboard, and I'm learning slowly how to sleep without pulling the covers over my head at 3 a.m. But there's a hitch stitch in me that pulls tight whenever I think about home, which is a house 2 hours north, on a wind-beaten street where gulls cry and the autumn smells of varnish and old wood hang like a prayer. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. The house I still call home, because legally my name is on nothing and emotionally I never quite left, is a clapboard place on Main Street in a dying mill town called Ashgrove. My parents, Helen and Martin Hart, have owned the place since before I can remember. They ran a small antique bookshop downstairs and lived above it. The bell on the shop door always tinkled like a question. The smell downstairs was always the same. Leather, dust, vanilla from the candle my mother insisted on burning, and the sour tang of stale cigarettes my father pretended he didn't smoke. On good days, the house was a museum of small, steady miracles. A repaired rocking chair, a grandmother's table. On bad days, which were more frequent than I let myself admit, it was a room full of quiet accusations. My relationship with my parents has always been a rope, frayed and stretched. Old photographs show a different story. The family at fireworks, my mother with a real smile, my father with both hands on the wheel of an old station wagon. Those photos are linen-smooth lies in my memory now. When I got older, I learned to read what their hands didn't say. The way my mother's jaw tightened when I asked about college. The way my father's laugh stopped when the phone rang. The unsaid ledger of favors and debts on which our lives quietly balanced. 3 weeks ago, on a gray Thursday that smelled of rain and cheap coffee, a man drove into Ashgrove and parked his black sedan outside our shop. My mother saw him from the upstairs window and went rigid, the way glass goes when cold comes close. My father started pacing like an old dog behind the counter. They closed the shutters in a hurry I later realized was panicked. That was the moment they tried to hide me. I wasn't actually living at the shop anymore, but I had come back to help them that afternoon because my brother, Jonah, had called sick and he was the one who usually took their deliveries. I had the key, which felt like both a burden and a promise. I unlocked the back door and found the floorboards vibrating with the tension of their whispering in the kitchen. When I mounted the stairs, the attic door was already propped open, and my mother shoved me up into the dark like she was tucking me into a secret she intended to smother. The attic smelled of cedar, mothballs, and old winter coats. It had low light and a single window that made a rectangle of daylight on the threadbare rug. They pushed a box of my childhood sweaters at my feet and told me to be quiet. My mother kissed the top of my head like she was trying to fuse us together with a lie. My father told me to stay put and to do what I tell you, which, to be fair, he rarely said unless the house was shaking. I climbed into that space like a thing hiding under a blanket, and as soon as the attic door closed, I realized 2 things. The first, that my chest felt too small for my lungs, and the second, that whatever shame they were trying to hide me from was larger than either of them. From the attic I could hear them downstairs. The low, measured voice of the man and the ripped under-a-table napkin voice of my mother arguing. I held my breath and listened. Every sound sounded like accusation. You can hear things better in silence. The way a spoon clinks, the rustle of paper, the pull of a chair leg over wood, the pitch of someone finally asking the question they were terrified to say aloud. A voice I didn't recognize said, "I would just like to speak to your daughter. It's important to me." He had a Midwestern drawl, the kind that places you on a map even if you don't want to be found. My mother's reply was a string of blocked-off words meant to look like calm. She's not well. She lives in Portland now. She isn't involved. We appreciate you looking out for us, but... Mrs. Hart, he said, soft as a hand. I don't want anything from you. I won't take anything from you. I just want to speak to Evelyn. My name. My whole body drew taut when I heard it. It felt like a bell someone had just hit after years of silence. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. I kept still in the attic because my mother always said the first rule of being a heart was to be invisible when adults were talking. But infuriatingly, the man down below didn't sound like an enemy. He sounded like a father who had lost something once and had spent the rest of his life looking for it. "Who are you?" my father asked. The scrape of his foot betrayed fear, or perhaps the old humility of a man who'd made one bad decision and paid for it. "My name is Arthur Lane," the man said. "I'm an investor." There was a slight emphasis on that last word, like he knew what the other one might take away if it sounded less like a hospital and more like a ledger. "I have a stake in the property on Maple. I was told the heart girl, Evelyn, was here. I would like to talk to her." The rest of the conversation dissolved into clipped sentences that slid past me. I could hear the fridge humming, the clock across the hall counting time like a judge. The sound of my mother's voice when she said, "You have no right," was low and sharp, and the way my father cursed under his breath when he asked the man to leave made the attic window rattle. At that moment, hidden under a shawl and a lifetime of learned silence, the present I live in and the past I had been taught to accept collided. I had a steady job, a life at a distance that felt safe because distance is a firewall. And yet here was a stranger who wanted to speak to me, a man my parents despised enough to shove me into a crawlspace. I pressed my palms to the cold window and watched the top of his head from a sliver of glass. He wasn't young. He had a receding hairline and a coat that had been tailored somewhere clean and expensive. He looked like the kind of person who had the power to change people's lives with a signature on a line I couldn't even find. But what did he want with me? Money, shame, reparation, or an idea larger and more frightening, the truth? When the attic door creaked and my mother's silhouette filled the rectangle like a cloud, she handed me a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and told me to stay put. "Don't peek," she hissed. "Do exactly as I say." I sat with the wax paper in my lap and the unfamiliar weight of being treated like something that could be lost. My stomach felt empty, but not from hunger. It felt like someone had unstitched a seam I had never known was holding me together. In the nibble of silence between the muffled adult voices downstairs, a small, stubborn thought rose up. Maybe what they were trying to hide wasn't protecting me from the world. Maybe they were hiding me from what I deserved. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. I mouthed to the empty attic because absurdly, the thought of a voice out there, yours, steadied me a little. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. They left me upstairs until dusk, and when they finally opened the attic door, it was with a caution that felt like a verdict. The man was gone. The bell of the shop made a hollow sound as a stranger's car drove away, tires flicking grit into the gutter. My mother smoothed her hands over her skirt like she had ironed out a crease that could not be fixed. That night, when I finally walked the 2 blocks to my car, the air was cold enough to make my breath steam. My hands shook as I turned the key, not from the cold but from the knowledge that my life might have an answer on the other side of that man's interest. But answers have a cost, and I didn't yet know who would be paying. When I fell asleep that night in Portland, it was with a sense of someone having placed a stone in my pocket I had forgotten existed. It was heavy and cold and full of possibility. The next morning I drove north to confront a man who had come to find me and parents who had learned to hide their sins in the shadow of my name. I had no idea then that what he wanted was not money or the deed to a building, but a conversation that would pry open everything we had kept closed for decades. The town of Ashgrove wakes up slow as a tide. Maple Street, where the heart shop sat like an old tooth in the line of storefronts, smells of diesel and frying oil in the early morning. The air had that thin, honest sharpness that comes right before summer folds into fall. When I returned the next day, my father's car was in its usual place by the curb, and Jonah was already sweeping up cigarette butts with a devotion that smelled of ritual. "You're early," Jonah muttered when he saw me. He didn't look at my face. He never does, not lately. His eyes dart like someone counting cards. When we were kids, he was the one who would set traps for neighborhood boys and laugh until he couldn't breathe. Now, his laughter had been replaced by an alertness that served the shop well and me poorly. Arthur Lane came by yesterday, I said, mostly to watch Jonah's face. He didn't even flinch. That was one of the things about this family. No one showed anything unless they were sure showing would get them something. He's an investor. He'll be back, Jonah said, as if it were a law. He shrugged like someone who had to learn how to be pragmatic about betrayal. Ma says lie to him. Tell him Evelyn's at school or in Portland. Keep the story tight. Don't involve him. The words lie to him felt like sand poured into my mouth. How many times had my parents asked me to put a lid on the truth? My throat tightened. Kept asking why. Why the panic? Why the secrecy? The house is old, yes, and the shop is small, but what's the fire they feared? People come to Ashgrove with brooms and stories. It's not usually a place that generates menacing suits. The more I asked, the more the shop closed like a hinge. When Arthur came back, and it wasn't long, he walked in like someone who had rehearsed humble patience until it fit like a coat. The bell over the door said his name in a small clink, and the shop seemed to hold its breath. "Good morning," Arthur said. He removed his hat with a civility that felt like an offering. His eyes were deliberately ordinary at first glance, but they had a way of landing on you like a lens. He didn't look around at our shelves of cracked spines and gilt-edged postcards the way most investors did. He looked for a particular figure, and then, when he didn't see me, his shoulders tightened. "Mr. Lane," my father said, smoothing his apron even though there was a speck of old glue on it. "We told you she doesn't." "Martin," Arthur interrupted kindly, with what felt like a patient sorrow. "I met your daughter once. A long time ago." He spoke as if time could be a thing you held between your palms and put back again. "She helped me on a night that changed my life." The shop became smaller around those words. The air had the metallic tang of something about to be revealed. "What do you want?" my mother asked. Her voice had become a tight wire. "I want to talk to Evelyn if it's possible," Arthur said. He was not forceful. He wasn't the man who had the power to waltz into our lives and take something at will. He sounded like someone carrying a weight he didn't know how to set down. I wanted to thank her. I wanted to tell her what she did was important. It wasn't the content but the tone that made my mother choke on her own breath. "We don't need your," she stopped. The look she gave my father was the kind that counts back debts. "You set aside a trust for her," my father blurted, like a hammer that had been held for too long and finally fell. The accusation hung there like a thing that could not be unsaid. Arthur nodded once, slow as an apology. "I did. After the accident, after my son. I wanted to make sure the girl who had saved him would be taken care of. I put money aside in her name with the understanding that she would be contacted when she was older. I never got the chance to find her then. I have been trying." My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes were wet with a lake of fear. She had the face of someone who had stolen a book of matches and then used them to keep the house warm. "We had no right," she said. "We spent it. We were sick. We thought." "You what?" Jonah's voice cut like a page turned too fast. He leaned out from behind the counter, his face a knot of disbelief. "You spent a trust meant for her? For college?" There are sentences that break the world into before and after. That was one. The shop, with its orderly rows of books, suddenly felt like a stage where the props had been rearranged against your will. My head started to spin. The room smelled like glue and lemon oil. For a moment I couldn't remember how to breathe. "How long?" I asked. My voice surprised me because it didn't wobble. Came out flat and precise. Some part of me had known about this, like a bruise under skin. My mother looked small then, like a paper cutout of a woman, her mouth moving without sound. She said, "We had medical bills. After you were sick. We thought we were helping keep the house. We thought we'd pay it back. After I was sick." The words were a tidal surge. Memory ripped open. I had been 12, fevered and delirious from an infection that had landed me in the hospital for 2 long weeks. They'd told me it was pneumonia at first, then a complication, then a series of blurrier and blurrier terms as the air around me thinned like an old photograph. In that time, my parents had promised me things that turned brittle. They had signed documents or asked for favors. They had made deals with men whose hands were warm and whose pockets smelled of money. You told me there wasn't anything for me, I said. I could feel the attic again, the shawl over my shoulders, the way my mother had pressed down on my head like she would push a fossil into the sand. You told me there was no money, that my choices were my own and also not ours to burden you with. You told me to be grateful. My father dropped his gaze. He had always been the softer of the two. You could see it in the way he never raised his voice and the way his knuckles were knobby with work. Evelyn, He started and then stopped because he had nothing to finish with that didn't sound like theft. That's the most galling thing, Arthur said quietly. Not the money. The never telling. My wife and I set it up because we promised ourselves we'd look after the girl who found our son. Not because we had to, but because the world was too cruel to the small acts of courage. We wanted to be part of that kindness. Then we lost track. We thought an address or a name could do the work. But someone else told me she'd been here, because the archivist in Kennebunk pointed out a photograph of a girl with a freckle on her cheek. I didn't come with business in mind. I don't want your shop. I don't want anything from you. He looked at me, and his eyes weren't anything my parents could manufacture. I want to speak to Evelyn. To tell her thank you and to see if she needs help. There it was. The bare, ridiculous thing I'd been desperate to ask and terrified to hear. The simple, almost childish admission that someone had been searching for me for years, that someone had been trying to be kind. If this is resonating with you, please give this story a like. Helps more than you know. My mother opened her mouth as if to say she'd done it for me. They'd spent the money to keep me alive, to keep a roof over our heads, to buy meds when insurance wouldn't. And somewhere in that breath there must have been shame. It was a shame that had nested in her for a long time. I remember stepping back from the counter then, the wood under my palms rough as the truth. My brother's face was unreadable. Arthur's hands were folded together as if in prayer. Outside the windows, Ashgrove went about the business of being a town. The bus hissed, a dog barked, someone in a truck called a name and got none in reply. What if I don't want to talk to him? My mother whispered. The question had a tremor that said she thought of her life as an unspooling skein that would break if touched wrong. Then you owe him the truth, Jonah said, harsh with a righteousness that tasted like revenge. You owe Evelyn the truth. I had never felt so naked and so alive. The knowledge that someone had been trying to find me by name lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. It also placed a ledger on the table. People keeping tabs, people who'd been promised things on my behalf. For years I'd carried the idea that my life had been mine to scramble through on my knees. Suddenly there were other hands in the story. Hands that wanted to give me something instead of take. Arthur placed a small leather portfolio on the counter. There are documents in here, he said. Letters, contracts, proof. And there's someone who has been waiting to say thank you. The words waiting to say thank you were like a bandage being removed. They left exposed what had been ached. My knees felt unsteady. I had not realized how hungry I was for something that wasn't a threat. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this plays out, I thought, saying it under my breath like an incantation. You, the listener, became the only other person in the room who could be trusted, if only because you could not be called at night to account for what you'd felt. My mother left the shop, clutching her purse like something to be held between apology and defense. My father sat down as if someone had told him to. Jonah and I were left with the folders like artifacts from a different existence, an existence where someone had tried to keep a promise. I asked Arthur to stay for coffee. He smiled with the exhaustion of someone who'd been traveling longer than he'd meant to. I don't want to take you away from anything, he said. I just want to make right if I can. That evening, with the light falling thin through the windows and the shop smelling of dust and lemon oil and the sharp aftertaste of revelation, I opened the leather portfolio and began to read. The first letter was written on stationery that no one in Ashgrove could afford. Thick, cream paper with heavy, careful handwriting that had the obedient loops of a man who had been trained to respect detail. To the girl who helped me on Maple Road. It began. The letter was dated 11 years earlier. Every line read like a small vow kept in secret. He remembered a little girl in a yellow raincoat and a freckle over her left eye who dragged his son out of the street after a truck had failed to stop. He remembered how she had bit her lip so she wouldn't cry, how she had insisted there was a loose tooth to be pulled after the rescue so the boy would be distracted. He said her name, Evelyn, spelled it right, thanked her for being brave. My hands trembled. A piece of my childhood slid into place, and it was not a thing I recognized as mine. The memory I'd suppressed, of a night the town had tried to forget, surfaced with sharp scent and light. The gas from a running engine, the smell of rain on hot metal, the copper tang of blood when my own lip split attempting to pull a tooth that wasn't ready. I had been 9. I remembered the sound of sirens like a parent calling me back to reality. I remembered the man on a stretcher thanking me with a voice that shook and promising to make sure I was okay. I remembered my mother hugging me as if she never wanted to let go. And then the months that followed where things seemed stitched up with cautiousness. Arthur's investment didn't feel like a business deal when I read the documents. It felt like a ledger of gratitude. He had set up a trust with a lawyer in Portland, money put away for education and future use as the beneficiary shall determine. He had asked that the firm attempt to locate the girl when she reached adulthood, but their search had stalled for reasons that read like middlemen's convenience and clerical mistakes. He had signed the paperwork again and again, as if to say, do not lose this. He wasn't rich in the cartoon sense. He was meticulously solvent. He had chosen to make this act of thanks into something that could, if it landed in the right hands, change a life. When I looked up from the letter, the shop was quiet, and Jonah watched me like he was measuring the angles of a tool before using it. It was your mother and father who diverted it, Arthur said simply, as if facts belong to the air between you and get heavy if they are not named. Not because they were evil, I don't know them that well, but because poverty can make people anxious, and anxious people make desperate choices. My father sank his face into his hands. It wasn't dramatic, only human. The knuckles of a man who had miscounted his life and discovered the sum owed. We thought if we left it we'd lose our home, he said, the sentence clumsy with the decades of fear hooked inside it. We thought if Evelyn knew she'd leave, we'd be alone. That's not, I started, but my voice didn't know where to land. All my life I had been told to understand why my parents did what they did. But that understanding had been almost a duty performed for their benefit, not for mine. Why didn't you tell me? Yes. The question was simple and small and large all at once. Demanded a truth like a coin. My mother said, we were trying to protect you. From disappointment, from bitterness. We thought we'd repay it slowly, that we'd pay it back. We can't give you what we don't have. Evelyn, you're the reason we kept this place together. Her words spilled like a confession and then dried on the tongue. I left the shop that afternoon with the papers folded into my jacket like a secret about to be revealed. Outside, the wind smelled like apple trees and rain. I called my supervisor and said I'd be late for my shift. Delight. The truth is I had to stand somewhere public and let the steady noise of the world ground me back into a person who knew what to do next. Arthur had offered to help before I'd even considered leaving. I can set up a new trust in her name, he said, when I met him that evening on the benches outside the library. I can help get her into a program if she wants. I don't expect anything. I don't want to take anyone's home. I only want to give her what was promised. I asked him, why do you care so much after all this time? Why find me now? He looked at me like someone drawing breath. Because my son died 2 years ago, he said, quiet and near. He never got to know why he was saved, and I promised myself I'd find the person who saved him. I promised myself to try to do right for them. My wife, she told me it's time to stop looking at what I've lost and start looking at what's left. Finding you is part of that. There are moments that carve themselves into you like notches. The raw sound of a stranger's grief, the way it opens a space in you where something can go in and mend. I felt those notches then and something like a map forming. But choosing was not simple. My parents looked at me like I might choose them or choose me, as if those were mutually exclusive. Jonah folded his arms and watched the exchange like a spectator at a fight. I felt at once guilty and furious. The money that had been promised to me might have paid for a school I couldn't afford, for therapy, for a small margin that could have rewritten a life. Instead, it had been the pillow that kept a house from collapsing. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything, I said out loud to no one in particular, because the public voice steadied me as much as the private one. I was aware of the oddness of turning to strangers at a time when my parents and brother were the ones who needed piercing conversation. I told Arthur I needed time to think. I told him I needed to stay in the shop a while longer to talk to my parents without people in the room who wanted things. He nodded and handed me one more folded page. His son's last note where he wrote, "Tell the girl in the rain thank you." It was a small human thing, childish handwriting and a childish request to pass on gratitude. When I went back into the shop, the air tasted like fried onions and the rust of old keys. The world had rearranged itself around an idea. Someone had tried to be kind to me, and someone close to me had decided kindness would cost them too much to give up. I sat at the counter and took a breath. The next step had to be mine, because everything that followed would be paid for either in anger or in courage. I had work in Portland the next morning and a decision to make. I pinched the paper between my fingers like a lifeline. The house at night is different than it is in daylight. Shadows grow teeth and old photographs seem to watch you misremember them. That night, I slept in the spare room because the attic felt like a cowed animal and the kitchen looked like the stage of crimes committed in daylight. I needed to be in the same house with my parents to see if their whispers fit into a pattern I could live with. When I woke at 2 in the morning, the house was quiet as a held breath. The wooden floors creaked with ghosts. I walked downstairs to clear my head and found my mother sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of bills and a small bottle of coffee gone cold. She looked like a woman who had been peeled thin. "Evelyn," she said when she saw me. There was a softness there that didn't exist in daylight. "We're not bad people." I sat across from her. "Have you ever thought about how it's possible to be wrong and kind at the same time?" "Yes. Because that's what it feels like. Like you did something wrong for a reason you thought was right." Tears gathered in her eyes. She said, "We thought we were protecting you. Being poor is a pressure you can't describe unless you live inside it. You wanted to go to art school and there was this scholarship, and then you were sick, and then the house." I cut her off because I wanted to hear the truth in its entirety, not in fragments that angled my sympathy like a weapon. "What else didn't you tell me?" "Yes." The words were gentle because I was making space for her to collapse or to be honest. She inhaled and then told me more than I'd expected. About past decisions, loans that had seemed like salvation and turned out to be knots of debt, about how they had changed their names on documents without telling me, about credit lines that disappeared like fog when it came time to sign something in my name. She told me about a night when my father had pawned an heirloom and cried in the storage room afterwards, apologizing to a thing that couldn't answer. She told me how afraid they'd been that if I knew the truth I'd walk away and leave them to collapse under the weight they'd built themselves. When she was finished, dawn was skidding light across the countertop like an unwanted cursor. The confession hung there like a lit bulb. I could have looked away. I could have stitched the thing into the fabric of my habitually forgiving heart. But I had read Arthur's letters. I had seen a man spend his life trying to return a favor to a child he never forgot. And I'd realized that my life had been silently negotiated without my input, like the signing of a document without my name. "I don't want to punish you," I told them. "But I also need to feel this is my story and not whatever you think will save you from a ledger." My father sat there and held my gaze. He was older than I had ever allowed myself to see. "We thought we were keeping the family together," he said. "We did what we thought might save our home, your home. We lied. We were selfish. And I'm sorry." The apology had a sound like a small animal being let out of a cage. It didn't fix anything. It only opened the room for an honest measuring. I wanted restitution not out of a desire for money, but out of a need to have known that adults in my life could keep promises to me as an individual. We negotiated till the sun was high and the town smelled like frying fish and new paperbacks. Arthur agreed to set up a new trust, this time with documentation I could read, sign, and control. He said he would not attempt to buy our shop or change the storefront unless I wished it. He offered mentorship and a quiet kind of patience I'd not known how to ask for. When the contracts were drawn up, the lawyer in town did something subtle. He put a clause that allowed for payment in stages with benchmarks of education and therapy funding. He also put my name as beneficiary with the power to direct funds. The paper was legal, thick with the weight of official things. Signing felt like the first adult choice I'd made that wasn't filtered through someone else's fear. But the financial reconciliation was only a piece of the work. The rest was the emotional economics of what it cost to forgive. My mother curled up with a cup of tea and told me, "We thought we'd be protecting you from disappointment. Instead, we taught you how to live with it." "It wasn't just disappointment," I said. "It was a lesson in what it costs to be invisible." Over the next weeks, conversations with Arthur became something resembling therapy. He would take me to coffee shops and talk about his son with an intimate kind of reverence. He never tried to replace what was gone. He tried to be a steady presence unhooked from expectation. He taught me ways to read contracts as if they were stories, introduced me to a woman who ran a small scholarship fund, and quietly paid for the first sessions of a therapist I could trust. My brother Jonah was more complicated. In some ways he was my protector. In others he resented me for being the one the family story orbited around. He had an idea of fairness that was thin, like a coat that doesn't quite keep out rain. We fought. We shouted and we sat with silence after. He had deep regrets and a temper that made him dangerous to be around. I had empathy and no patience for his slow-burning anger. In time he apologized in private, and he asked, in a way that smelled like a person testing a new shape of himself, if he could come with me sometimes to appointments. He wanted to be part of the repair. I accepted, cautious as a person testing a patch of ice. Sometimes at night, I would open Arthur's supplementary letters and read them out loud. He'd written to say he wanted to help, not be a savior, to help without stroking the ember of shame in my parents' lives. He had no children left to raise, and the ache it left made him tender. "I don't want to buy you," he would say. "I want to sit and talk to you when the nights are long." I noticed that the more I stepped out of the role my parents had cast me in, the quiet daughter who could be hidden, the less power their shame held over me. The attic didn't feel like a room to hide in anymore. It felt like a place that had once been a refuge but had also been a place of concealment. I began to clear it out by myself, making space in it for me rather than for secrets. The smell of cedar and old coats receded as I opened windows and let in sun. The small things I kept, an old watercolor I painted at 15 and a chipped mug, felt like anchors rather than weights. If this story is finding you, and if some part of you recognizes the small, aching space where a truth was withheld, then please drop a comment. Has something like this happened to you? I'm reading everything, and the way you name your story might be the only salve someone else needs. Slowly, very slowly, my relationship with my parents began to change. There were fits of progress followed by collapses of old habits. My mother and I began to have real conversations about money, about what it means to ask for help without being ashamed, about how poverty can make you creative and cruel. My father went to meetings for men with debt problems. Jonah and I, after a raw argument that left us both shaking, went out to the bar and ordered the worst whiskey in town and then sat with silence until we could speak again. There was no cathartic scene where a door slammed and everyone left. Redemption isn't a doorway. It's a narrow path you keep choosing to walk down. Sometimes I thought I was walking toward a person I could forgive. Other times I was simply walking away. Yet, in the quiet moments when the wind hit the eaves and the town settled into the kind of hush that makes you listen to your own pulse, I would feel the ache of gratitude swell. For a stranger who had kept a promise across years, for parents who had been fallible and frightened, for a brother who started trying to be braver than his anger. These were threads I would stitch into a new life. We made a list of things to do. set up the trust, meet with a counselor, catalog the shop's debts honestly, and, a small thing that felt like a right, repaint the front porch in a color that signaled we were not hiding any longer. Arthur stayed at a distance that was respectful. He never demanded to be part of our family picture. He simply made himself available, which is, oddly, one of the kindest things a person can do. In the end, the investor came for a conversation and left with more than he had had before. The knowledge that the person he'd spent years trying to find was finally, painfully, beautifully, saying her story out loud. I moved out of the house that summer. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, only to find that the ground was there, solid and waiting. My apartment in Portland felt warmer because I made it mine in small, defiant ways. A plant that survived, a lamp that cast light in a circular comfort, a shelf of books that were chosen because I wanted to read them, not because they fit a narrative someone else had written for me. Arthur and I kept in contact, but not in a way that stitched us into a manufactured kinship. He was a presence who proved that sometimes people return not to take but to repair. He funded the initial tuition for a community college program I'd always half-dreamed about and wouldn't let the town's shame define my access to education. He did not try to fix the moral calculus of my parents' decisions. He simply put his resources where his gratitude led. My parents and I built a slow, brittle reconciliation. We learned that apologies are not transactions. They are, instead, the recognition that two people have hurt each other and will now, if they are brave, try to do less harm. My mother went to community meetings about managing finances. My father volunteered to teach kids how to repair books in the shop as a way of giving back. Jonah and I pivoted toward a new kind of brotherhood where he could admit his resentments and I could meet him with limits. The shop did not become the gleaming success that a lot of investor stories promise. It remained as it always had been. A modest place where people came to buy used paperbacks and drink coffee and sometimes, in the summer, listen to a man read an old poetry book aloud. But the front porch was painted a color that didn't pretend to be invisible anymore. People noticed. Some of them, who had been customers for decades, told stories about the little girl in the yellow raincoat and how brave she had been. It felt strange and tender to hear those memories glide back toward me like driftwood. There were nights when I still woke with my heart a drum in my chest, and it would take me a few seconds to remember that the attic was no longer a place I had to hide in. There were mornings when I would stand at my kitchen sink and think about the choices my mother had made, and some mornings I would feel nothing but a cool, steady compassion. Growth isn't a tidy arc. It's messy, it takes detours, and sometimes it circles back on itself. But it is a move forward nonetheless. If this story is resonating with you, if a thread in it has tugged at old wounds, please like and share so other people who might hold similar silences can hear it. If you have a story like this, drop it in the comments. I'm reading every one and I believe the act of naming can be small and revolutionary. The last time I saw Arthur, he handed me a key. Not to an office or a bank vault, but to the spare room upstairs at his sister's place in Portland. A place he said I could use when I needed some calm, somewhere that smelled of linen and the sea. No obligations, he said. Just a place. Why are you doing this? I asked, the way you ask someone why they hand you a gift and then expect nothing in return. He shrugged, almost embarrassed. Because I promised, he said. And because once, a long time ago, someone had something to give me back. We are all allowed to pay that forward. Took the key. The metal was cool and solid in my palm. I thought about the way my life had been hidden from me like a fossil in the earth, and then unearthed like a truth that could be handled and studied but also had to be respected. I thought about my parents and the ways people wound themselves up to survive. I thought about Jonah and all the ways brotherhood can be mended when the people involved are willing to be small and open and honest. This story didn't end with a dramatic courtroom scene or a cinematic redemption. There were no villains marched off stage. There were only human beings trying to do better after being shown that kindness could be given without strings attached. The investor who came to buy our shop had only wanted, at first, to say thank you. In saying that, he pulled a thread that unraveled old lies and allowed us all, clumsy, bruised, ashamed, hopeful, to begin stitching a new garment. If you stayed with me this far, thank you. It means the world to me that a stranger would carry this load for a little while. My final ask is simple. Subscribe if you want to hear more lived stories like mine. They are messy, but they are real, and sometimes that's what saves us. I learned, finally and painfully, that being hidden rarely protects the heart. The only true protection is giving someone the agency to choose, to know, and to forgive or to leave of their own accord. That is the lesson I keep close when the nights are long. Truth doesn't always make the world easier, but it gives you a chance to make it honest.